Night, November 29th, 2012. An officer with the Cleveland Police Department pulled over this couple. Timothy Russell was at the wheel. Melissa Williams is in the passenger seat. The couple pulled over. But then, for whatever reason, before the officer could approach their car for that traffic stop, they took off. They sped away. And they happened to speed past Cleveland Police Headquarters. And just as they did that, their car backfired. It happened. It was an older car. It was a 1979 Chevy Malibu. It apparently backfired, and officers mistook that car backfiring for a gunshot. And what happened next, basically, is that all hell broke loose. A high-speed chase ensued. 62 police cars chased those two suspects in that one car through the street. 62 police cars. More than 100 Cleveland police officers involved in that one police chase. This is how the police officers involved recalled what happened that night.
After a 22-minute chase, pursuing officers told investigators they arrived on scene with the idea one or both suspects were armed, pointed weapons during the chase, and fired a gun to start it. Officer Wilfredo Diaz told investigators the passenger reached towards something, produced what he perceived was a gun. Officer Scott Sistick feared he would be struck by the suspect's vehicle. Detective William Salupo heard gunfire and saw Sistick go to the ground, believing he had been run over. Officer Cynthia Moore, believing the subjects were firing at her, returned fire through the windshield of her cruiser. Partner Officer Michael Brelo said, "I've never been so afraid in my life." He climbed on top of cruiser CPD 238 and fired downward through the windshield. Officer Brian Sobolek thought he was in the suspect's line of fire. He shot 2 rounds. Officer Michael Farley described the scene as the scariest thing that I've seen in my whole life. Officer Randy Patrick was taking fire. He got up and let some rounds off. Officer Paul Bach said it was a major shootout. Something hit Officer Bach's in the vest. He felt it but thought it might be a ricochet. Detective Michael Rickus believed he saw an officer fall. Detective Michael Demchek believed the suspects were wearing bulletproof vests. Partner Detective Aaron O'Donnell thought the driver was shooting and the passenger reloading. And Detective Christopher Eric said someone was on the radio saying, "They're shooting at us. We're shooting at officers."
Nobody was shooting at those officers. Nobody was shooting except the other officers. There were so many police officers there, so jacked up, and so many of them were shooting. Police did turn it into a huge firefight in an incredible shooting gallery, but they were the only ones. Timothy Russell and Melissa Williams were unarmed. They were not wearing bulletproof vests. They fired 0 shots because they had 0 weapons. All 137 shots fired that night were fired by Cleveland police officers. More than a dozen officers fired their weapons that night. Timothy Russell and Melissa Williams, again unarmed, were each shot more than 20 times. One of the officers who fired shots that night did so from the top of a squad car. Officer Michael Brelo got up on top of a squad car, stood on top of the car, and then shot 15 rounds down at the suspects through their windshield. He was up on a police car, firing down at them. He'd already emptied a previous clip. He reloaded in order to do that. Officer Brelo was the only officer charged with the crime following that completely bizarre incident. The officer was charged with voluntary manslaughter. And this past weekend, Officer Brelo, the one who climbed up on top of the car to shoot down into the windshield, he was found not guilty. 137 shots fired into that car. 2 unarmed people, both shot more than 20 times. Only 1 officer charged, and that officer acquitted of everything. The verdict was announced on Saturday. The resulting demonstrations in Cleveland were mostly peaceful, although there were some skirmishes. Ultimately, 71 people were arrested for things like blocking streets or not obeying police orders. Today, religious leaders and faith leaders in Cleveland led another demonstration on the same issues. And this has all been happening over these last few days, leading up to what was expected today to be a major announcement by the U.S. Department of Justice about exactly how broken policing is in the major city of Cleveland and maybe how to try to fix it. That massive police chase, those 137 shots fired at the unarmed suspects back in 2012, more than 60 police cars. That was one of the use of force cases that led the Justice Department to come into the city of Cleveland to review that department's standards and practices. Well, today the Justice Department announced their recommendations and reforms. This is not the first time the Justice Department has tried to step in and reform the Cleveland Police Department. They tried to do it a decade ago as well. But this is the first time that Cleveland legally has to abide by the Justice Department's prescribed fixes. This is a legal settlement. It is not voluntary. This time a federal judge will be in charge of making sure that Cleveland actually does what the Justice Department has recommended that they do. The recommendations are legally binding. And some of the recommendations announced today in this more than 100-page long report, they sound promising. The Cleveland Police Department, for example, will have to hire somebody who has never worked for the police department before, who's not an insider, but who will have the authority to investigate the department, including any wrongdoing within the department. And that person will be empowered to make the results of his or her investigations available to the public. They're calling that person an inspector general. There will also be a federally appointed monitor separate from that inspector general role, who will not only report to the judge about whether Cleveland's abiding by this decree. That federal monitor will also have access to all of the department's data, who they're stopping and searching, who they're using force against, their internal reports about use of force incidents. That monitor will be reporting straight to the judge on whether Cleveland's making enough progress in a timely way. So there are some recommendations, mostly in the oversight department, that do seem promising. If nothing else, we'll get more information about what new horrible things they're doing in terms of policing in Cleveland. There are, however, some recommendations in this report that I, reading them, found surprising and a little bit alarming. Surprising because it was not self-evident to me that in a year like 2015, a major city police department like the Cleveland PD would need to be told to do things like this in the first place. For one thing, Cleveland police, as of today, must stop frequently pistol whipping people. Pistol whipping, or as the Cleveland Plain Dealer helpfully spelled it out today in their headline, pistol whipping is hitting people on the head with guns. That must now be considered deadly force in Cleveland. In the past, Cleveland police apparently have not really considered pistol whipping to be a super dangerous thing. They filed pistol whipping under the lesser lethal force category that's actually what they called it, less lethal force. Even though a gun obviously can quite easily and accidentally go off when it is used to whack somebody in the head. And accidental discharging of an officer's gun while the officer was using the gun as a baton, that has happened in Cleveland several times. Another reform, officers in Cleveland will now be retrained to give suspects first aid if they see that the person is hurt and needs first aid. Again, why is that not already the standard protocol? Cleveland police will also no longer be allowed to shoot at moving cars unless the car is about to cause lethal damage. That's apparently not the rule already, even though don't shoot at moving cars has been standard at, say, the NYPD since 1972. Perhaps the top of the list in the obvious reforms category is this one. The Cleveland Police Department now pledges that they will read the personnel files of their new police recruits before they hire them. Check the file of the person you're about to hire. This is something that Cleveland is being ordered to start doing because they have not been doing that, which is itself amazing. But it also specifically gets to one major unknown still hanging over the city of Cleveland and that police department, and in a sense the country as a whole when it comes to policing, because it was in Cleveland last November that 12-year-old Tamir Rice was shot and killed in a police encounter with the Cleveland PD that lasted a couple of seconds start to finish, start to death. Because 12-year-old Tamir Rice was hanging out in a playground playing with a pellet gun. And there's grainy surveillance footage that I'm about to show you. It's shot from far away, but it is disturbing. Officers approach 12-year-old Tamir Rice and shoot and kill him almost instantly. The entire interaction less than 3 seconds. When the name of the officer who shot and killed Tamir Rice in that interaction was made public, it was revealed that that officer had a, quote, dismal performance record with the previous suburban police department in which he had served. That officer's previous boss had basically recommended that that guy be forced to leave policing, that no amount of training could help him. That was in his personnel file from his previous police job, but Cleveland police didn't care because they never bothered to read that guy's personnel file, and they hired him anyway. And that guy ended up shooting and killing 12-year-old Tamir Rice less than 3 seconds after first laying eyes on him at that Cleveland park last November. So yeah, new rule. Read personnel files from their old job before you hire somebody to be a Cleveland police officer and hand them a gun. That one seems doable. That one maybe will help. No officer officers have yet been charged in the shooting death of Tamir Rice. That investigation is still ongoing, but the results of that investigation, whether anybody involved, any of the officers will be ultimately charged, that is a big unknown still hanging over Cleveland right now, even with that big announcement today about reforming the police department. And of course it hangs over the protests, the peaceful protests in the streets of Cleveland. And in the meantime, while we wait to learn what will happen in the Tamir Rice case, the Cleveland Police Department and the Department of Justice say they will get to work implementing these changes right away. These fixes for what is broken at the Cleveland PD, they will get to work on it right away. And yet, not soon enough. Not even close. Joining us now is Pastor Richard Gibson from the Elizabeth